After the release of Resident Evil: The Umbrella Chronicles, the game was surprisingly successful for a rail shooter spin-off of a survival horror franchise, selling well over 1 million copies worldwide. Seeing this success, and still wanting to retell the other classic Resi stories in the same format, one of the lead producers of The Umbrella Chronicles, Masachika Kawata, greenlit a sequel to it called Resident Evil: The Darkside Chronicles. On top of just retelling the stories that they weren't able to in the previous entry, he also wanted to include more original story content and place a much stronger emphasis on the horror of the RE franchise to balance out the non-stop action. So the Capcom and Cavia teams got to working together, and after a shockingly smooth development, Resident Evil: The Darkside Chronicles would be released to the world in November of 2009. So would the Darkside Chronicles manage to meaningfully improve upon its predecessor's formula, or would it just end up being more of the same with different levels? Well, let's talk about it. But before getting too far into the video, I should mention that this is the 17th in a series of videos where I'm playing and reviewing every game in the Resident Evil franchise in release order. You don't have to have seen the other videos in the series in order to enjoy this one, but I would definitely recommend that you've at least seen my video on the Umbrella Chronicles, as I'm going to be comparing the Darkside Chronicles to its direct predecessor quite a bit throughout the video. So if you want to check that out first, or you're just interested in the rest of the retrospective in general, I'll have the full series playlist in the description below. But with that out of the way, Resident Evil: The Darkside Chronicles is an on-rails light gun shooter developed and published by Capcom with support from Cavia that was released exclusively for the Nintendo Wii in 2009. The game was once again built around using the Wii Remote's pointer controls to aim and shoot at BOWs, a premise that is still almost good enough to convince me that building an entire console around pointer and motion controls was a good idea. Almost. The game opens with an entirely original scenario titled Operation Javier. This is a story that sees returning characters Leon Kennedy and Jack Krauser dealing with an intentional release of the T-virus down in South America in the year 2002. A man named Javier Hidalgo is the leader of a local drug cartel, but when his wife suddenly becomes sick with an incurable illness, he turns to the Umbrella Corporation to find a cure for her. They administered a dose of the T-virus to her, which did prevent her from being killed by her illness, but also horrifically mutated her, resulting in the loss of her humanity. This caused Javier to lose all the trust that he had in the Umbrella Corporation from that point on. So roughly 10 years later, he releases the T-virus and all of the BOWs provided to him by Umbrella on the local population in an act of retaliation against them. You know, as you do. This leads to Leon and Krauser being sent in to clean up the mess and prevent any further spread of the virus, which is awesome from a story perspective, as we actually get to see that earlier relationship that we were told these two had in RE4 play out on screen. And opening the game with their big original scenario this time was also a great move in my opinion. In Umbrella Chronicles, you had to play through the retellings of RE0, 1, and 3 all before getting to the new original story content that was added by that game. This is perfectly fine for dedicated fans of the series, which I'm sure most of you guys watching will be, but for most casual fans, you'd probably want to get some of that new story content before you reach the final quarter of the game. At the end of the first level of the Operation Javier scenario, Krauser notices that Leon seems to have experience fighting these bioweapons, which prompts Leon to tell him about the Raccoon City incident. This brings us to the second scenario of Darkside Chronicles, Memory of a Lost City. This scenario is a retelling of the events of Resident Evil 2, and sees Leon and Claire Redfield fighting together through the streets of Raccoon City, the RPD, and of course, the underground Umbrella Labs. If you've seen my video on RE2, you already know that I have a massive soft spot for that game, so getting to move through what's basically a remastered version of the classic RPD layout while blasting the most iconic enemies from that game was an absolute blast for me. Speaking of, unlike the Umbrella Chronicles, they actually remade RE2's city street sections and RPD from scratch this time instead of just reusing the existing maps from the Outbreak games. And it was also really interesting to see how they blended the various canon events from both the A and B scenarios of the original RE2 into one continuous storyline, since both Claire and Leon are now together throughout the entirety of the Raccoon City incident here. It kept things really interesting in a way that I honestly just wasn't expecting, as the constant bouncing between A and B scenario events made the story feel so different to a typical RE2 playthrough, despite the fact that the events of the game's story haven't really been changed all that much. After playing through all of the RE2 scenario, we return to Operation Javier for a bit, where we learn that Javier actually has a daughter, Manuela Hidalgo. We meet her when she's trying to run away from her father, and while we don't learn much about the specifics, we do learn that Manuela has become sick with the same illness that her mother had a decade prior. When she became sick, Javier panicked and tried to find a way to cure her without losing her humanity like what happened with his wife. This search ultimately led him to Albert Wesker's organization, who offered him a sample of the T. Veronica virus to inject Manuela with them also instructing Javier to regularly transplant her organs over the course of 15 years to allow her body to adapt to the virus without transforming. When we learn about this, it leads Leon to remember what Claire had told him about her encounter with the T. Veronica virus on Rockford Island, leading us into our third and final scenario of the game, Game of Oblivion. This is a retelling of Code Veronica's events that see Claire and Steve Burnside fighting against the Ashford twins both on Rockford Island and in the Umbrella facility in Antarctica. I've always felt that Code Veronica had one of the strongest atmospheres and some of the coolest locations in the entire series, so seeing it get a facelift here with some higher detail and nicer lighting is really awesome, especially when you get to see it from a first-person perspective. I really enjoyed this scenario as well, but it's probably my least favorite of the three, mostly because of some strange decisions that were made while developing it. For example, Wesker does appear a couple of times, but he's only ever lurking in the shadows and watching the main characters from a distance rather than getting actively involved, which is quite a bit different from what he was doing in the original release of Code Veronica. And even weirder is that there's a giant skip after the Nosferatu fight that goes straight from defeating that boss to Claire being rescued by Chris near the end of the game. I'm assuming this was done because after the Nosferatu fight in Code Veronica, not only do Claire and Steve get separated, but this is also the point where we jump over to Chris Redfield's part of the story. But those who have played Code Veronica will already know that Chris moves through this part of the game entirely alone, so for a game like this that's built around being played in co-op with a second player, they don't have any sort of partner character for that entire chunk of the game. It's a really weird skip, and one that's super jarring if you've played Code Veronica before playing Darkside Chronicles, but one that's ultimately understandable once you take a second to think about it. Plus, you do at least get to play as Chris Redfield in the final level of the scenario instead of Steve, so it's hard to stay mad at it for too long. After finishing up the Code Veronica stuff though, we return to Operation Javier, and the remainder of this scenario makes up the rest of the game. There's a surprising amount of strong lore introduced by this scenario, and the general storyline, while admittedly a little underdeveloped due to it all being packed into this roughly 2-hour-long story, is really damn entertaining and goes in some wildly unexpected directions. If you're a big fan of the world-building aspects and the overall lore of the earlier Resident Evil titles, you'd probably really enjoy the story of Operation Javier, since it kind of pulls a bit from and even expands upon most of those pre-RE4 titles. But I've spent plenty of time talking about the scenarios and the story of the game, so now let's get into how the game actually plays. To start, I really do have to mention that the presentation is a significant step up from Umbrella Chronicles. Kawata stated in a Q&A back in the day that the only thing separating the Darkside Chronicles visuals from titles on things like the Xbox 360 or the PlayStation 3 was that the Wii's internal resolution was a good bit lower, making the overall image a lot fuzzier compared to those next-gen titles. Now, having upscaled the game to 4K for the sake of recording this video, I do think he was exaggerating a bit. But I also have to admit that this game looks really damn good for the majority of its runtime, and it's especially impressive for a Wii game. And if you don't think he was exaggerating, just keep in mind that the Darkside Chronicles was released about 8 months after Resident Evil 5. So, yeah, enough said. That being said though, the team did a lot of things outside of just increasing the fidelity of the textures and the models that have really upped the presentation game here. Firstly, they've added in an actual first-person view model that will pull your weapon into frame and actually reload it when you reload, which not only looks cool, but really helps to increase your overall immersion and make you feel like you're actually controlling one of these badass survivors. Additionally, you'll actually be able to see your partner walking around with you throughout the levels now, which does really help you feel like you actually have a partner when playing in solo, rather than just hearing random voice lines from them occasionally like in the Umbrella Chronicles. And while we're on the topic of increasing immersion, it would be hard to not talk about the camera shake in this game. The developers put a ton of effort into improving their camera shake effects in this game to make them look more believable, and while they certainly achieved that, they can be pretty disorienting at times. Not only does the camera shake around a lot during certain set pieces, but the intense shaking can also be pretty disruptive from a gameplay perspective, as they make it fairly difficult to aim at times. And on top of that, if you're someone who's prone to motion sickness, this game is going to absolutely destroy you. So this can be really annoying, but I do have to admit that the new camera shake effects definitely do make the more chaotic moments in the game feel even more out of control, so there are some positives with it, but also a lot of negatives. And on top of making some really good looking original maps for this game, they also made a ton of new zombie models that look really good as well. There are also a staggering amount of unique zombie models in this game compared to previous RE titles, with each scenario having its own pool of zombie models to pull from, and the variety even just within the individual scenarios being pretty damn good. Additionally, they made a bunch of original monster designs for Operation Javier that are mostly fantastic, and a lot of the existing BOWs from RE2 or CV have never looked as good as they do here. I mean, hell, they even made Code Veronica's Bandersnatches look intimidating, which is a serious achievement in and of itself. And as one final note on the presentation, the series staple of unintentionally funny dialogue is very much alive in this one, with some real zingers here that made me not just smile during my playthrough, but genuinely laugh out loud.
What's happening on this island?
Someone must have attacked. Caused a biohazard.
Biohazard?
Most importantly of all though, the game is still incredibly fun to play. The gameplay is still pretty much entirely based around blasting BOWs in classic on-rail shooter fashion, but they've made a lot of changes and improvements to the core gameplay here that really make it a lot more fun. One of the biggest changes is that instead of starting each level with your pistol and one unlocked weapon of your choice like you did in the Umbrella Chronicles, you can now start with a full loadout of your pistol and 3 unlocked weapons. That alone would have been a huge change, but it's only one part of a larger change. See, in Darkside Chronicles, you can actually just pause the game and swap your equipped weapons at any time, meaning you effectively have access to all of your collected weapons at all times. So if you run out of ammo in your big boss-killing weapon during a difficult fight, you no longer have to make do with your weaker weapons or your pistol. You can instead just swap out to another one of your big boss-killing weapons. This is a change that I'm admittedly a little bit mixed on, as it is fun to have access to all of your available options all the time, but it does totally break the balance of boss fights most of the time, since you can now just use all of your magnum ammo, then swap to your grenade launcher and use all of the ammo from that, then swap to your rocket launcher to finish them off. It made it so that I didn't even have to learn any of the boss mechanics for basically any of the bosses in the entire second half of the game, since I was just killing them before I even had to. Which is a real shame because much like the Umbrella Chronicles, the boss fights are really good in this game, with the final boss in particular being one of the wildest spectacle fights from the entire franchise to date. And instead of having 17 unique weapons in the game like its predecessor, the developers have narrowed down the sandbox quite a bit, with players now having access to a total of 7 weapons in the Darkside Chronicles. This might sound like a massive downgrade, but it's not really any better or worse, just different. So instead of having 5 different weapon categories that each have 3 slight variations within them, they just made one weapon for each of those categories, since you wouldn't really need to swap between 3 different shotguns when they all do the same job. And interestingly, grenades now take up one of your dedicated weapon slots rather than just being usable at any time, which I'm assuming was done to balance things out and prevent you from throwing grenades and shooting powerful weapons at the same time for massive damage like you could in the Umbrella Chronicles. And while we're on the topic of weapons, the Darkside Chronicles also now uses a much more traditional gold currency system for upgrading the weapons, rather than that weird star system that we saw back in the Umbrella Chronicles. Gold can be found throughout the levels, either in spawns that are totally out in the open, or ones that are hidden with indestructible objects in the environments. So now, shooting every destructible object that you come across doesn't just increase your letter grade at the end of the level, but it also directly rewards you with more currency for upgrades. Interestingly though, the game no longer provides you more currency for higher letter grade completions. So if you want to earn more gold for upgrades, you no longer have to worry about your overall rank. You only have to focus on shooting everything in the environment to find as much as possible. I'm not huge on this change, as I personally feel like rewarding players for just generally performing better while playing is a total no-brainer, so I think that taking it away in this game was a bit of a misstep. Overall though, the upgrade system is still totally functional, it's just a bit grindier than the one in the previous game. Another core mechanic that's been moved to the pause menu here is the healing. In Umbrella Chronicles, you could use herbs to heal just by seeing them in the environments and picking them up, which would instantly heal you when you did so. You could also find first aid sprays in the levels that would just sit in your inventory and be used automatically if you died, acting as a sort of second chance mechanic. Here in the Darkside Chronicles though, the first aid sprays work the exact same way, but the green herbs have been changed pretty majorly. When you grab an herb from the environment, they now enter your inventory rather than just being used right away, and if you want to use one, you have to pause the game and activate it manually from the menu. This might sound like a really small change, but it's actually a pretty major one because of the effect that it has on the overall gameplay pacing. Pausing the game in the middle of an intense fight to go heal would already disrupt the strong pacing and high tensions on its own, but when you also factor in how long it actually takes to open and close the menu on the Wii's hardware, it becomes just long enough to be incredibly annoying. And I'm not really sure why they couldn't have just had your herb count on the screen somewhere and let players activate them with a single button either, because this game is played using the Wii Remote and the nunchuck, and they aren't exactly using every button on the controller or anything, so something like that could have just made the healing feel a lot smoother while still letting you stock up on the herbs and activate them manually. I might be nitpicking a little bit, but it genuinely bothered me every time I had to pause the game to heal myself, and the solution is right there, so I felt like I had to bring it up. But to balance out a lot of these weirder changes, the level design in the Darkside Chronicles is much better than it was in its predecessor, with the game no longer trying to pull cheap tricks with enemies popping up on screen and hitting you instantly, and encounters in general just being much more balanced even into the final levels of the game. This makes the levels of the Darkside Chronicles a lot less frustrating to play, as it no longer feels like the game is cheating just to kill you a couple extra times and slow down your progress. Despite this though, it feels like the Darkside Chronicles will be a much less replayable game than the Umbrella Chronicles, due to the increased emphasis on the atmosphere and the storytelling. See, the game frequently pauses the action to let you get a good look around at the environments or to have some longer dialogue exchanges between you and your partner, and while all of that is perfectly fine your first time playing through the levels, this sort of pacing does lead to some less enjoyable replays. This slower and more heavily atmospheric pacing works great in the classic era survival horror titles of the series, but this isn't a slow-paced horror title. It's an arcade shooter where you're going to be replaying the levels over and over again to try to get higher rank completions of them and max out your weapon upgrades. So like I said, the pacing is really nice your first time going through the levels and leads to an awesome first playthrough, but going back for higher ranks and such is a bit more annoying here because of it. And as one final note to wrap things up here, a lot of the lore entries are now tied in with an in-game model viewer, which is a really nice touch. It's just more fun to read lore when you can also look at the model and really appreciate all of its details and animation work while you're reading about it. Not everything that the game has lore on has an appropriate in-game 3D model, so some of the lore entries just have pictures in the background instead, but it's still a really cool inclusion for everything that actually does have one. Overall though, I really enjoyed my time with the Darkside Chronicles. It retells the stories and reimagines the environments of two of my favorite RE games from when I was a kid, and tells a really entertaining original story that retroactively adds a lot more depth to the story of Resident Evil 4. There are parts of the game that I didn't love quite as much as the Umbrella Chronicles, and it doesn't have any of those awesome bonus scenarios seen in the first game either, but it's generally just such an improvement over it in every major category. The shooting feels better, the level design has been improved, the presentation is frankly amazing, and it might just be one of the best on-rail shooters I've ever played. I mean seriously, I'm not normally a huge fan of rail shooters, but I enjoy them. And while Umbrella Chronicles was a surprisingly good time for me, Darkside Chronicles kind of blew me away because I was just having such a blast playing it. I can honestly say that even if you're an RE fan but not really a fan of on-rail shooters, you'll probably really enjoy this one, and I would genuinely recommend that you check it out if you ever have the chance. So at the end of the day, I'm going to give Resident Evil The Darkside Chronicles an 8 out of 10. Hey guys, thanks for making it to the end of the video. We are once again firmly in spin-off territory for the next few episodes, but hopefully you guys enjoy regardless, and maybe you'll even find one of your new favorite Resi games from it. As always, if you enjoyed the video, feel free to leave a like, a comment, a subscription, or even share the video with a friend of yours who might enjoy it. Just really anything to help out with the whole algorithm thing. And if you really enjoyed it and want to help support the series even further, consider checking out my Patreon or my YouTube memberships, where you can get things like behind-the-scenes updates, early video access, and more. As always, a huge thank you to everyone who contributes to the channel through these. Thank you again for watching, and I hope to see all of you right back here for the next Resident Evil review.